Kia ora koutou ko, Victoria McLennan toka wingawa, but please call me Vic, and welcome to this ITP webinar on immigration. For those who don't know, IT Professionals is a membership-based organisation. I'm sure the majority of you here are our members, and we're focused on lifting the capability of those who are working in the digital technology workforce, with a particular focus on helping with career development, improving diversity of our workforce, and in this tight labour market, supporting all of the fabulous employers out there with some of the challenges that they're having at the moment with finding access to staff. And as such, we thought it'd be great if we could get Immigration New Zealand to come and talk about some of the changes that are occurring with immigration settings, and particularly those that are pertinent to the digital technology industry in this really, really tight labour market. I've got a couple of housekeeping things first before I hand over to our speakers. So, first thing is that the only people you can see on camera are those who are speaking, and we're the only ones who are going to be speaking today. We have a Q&A function here in Zoom, so if you click on the little Q&A button, you're very welcome to ask questions, which I will then relay to our speakers after they've given us a brief presentation. So Craig and Carl, who are here from Immigration, are going to give us a presentation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A opportunity for 15 to 20 minutes. I think we should have this all wrapped up by 10 to, so you've all got time to grab some lunch and go out in the sunshine before the end of your lunch breaks. When we get to the Q&A, if you'd like to ask questions, please do so via that Q&A function, and I'll facilitate them. If we have too many questions and we can't possibly fit them all in, then, or if we have really specific questions that aren't generic or suitable for the entire audience, that there's something just pertaining to you, then I'd prefer it if you could just ask general questions. That'll be interesting to everybody. But if there are too many questions, then I can facilitate relaying them back and coming back to everyone who is on this webinar with the answers at a later date, because it's possible that Carl and Craig might not know the answers, or we just might not have time to get to them. And we are recording this video, and all going well, we'll publish it, so you'll be able to share it with your colleagues to re-watch the presentation later. So welcome everyone, really appreciate you joining us here in your lunch break on this Wednesday. Here in the capital, it's a bit of a grey day. The sun keeps trying to come out, but it hasn't been very successful, but it is absolutely freezing cold. I hope you're all nice and warm wherever you are in the country. And with that, I'm going to put myself on mute, turn my camera off, and hand over to these fabulous speakers from Immigration New Zealand, who are Carl Andrews and Craig Walsh, who are going to walk through some of the changes that are occurring with immigration settings and our ability to bring workers into the country. So Carl and Craig, over to you. Kia ora.
Thanks very much, Vic. So thanks, Crispy. We can just move on perhaps to the next slide. Be good, thanks. Yeah, what we're going to do today is we're going to try and keep this webinar to a fairly high level, because there's a lot of detail that sits behind it, but if we were here to go into the detail in any great depth, we'd be here for a couple of hours. So the idea of this presentation will be really to give you an overview of how the process will work from an immigration perspective, and for you as an employer in dealing with the Accredited Employer Work Visa and what it means and how it works. So we'll do a quick recap of the Accredited Employer Work Visa process as it currently is and where it's at now. A little bit about the immigration rebalance, which is around the government's plan to increase productivity and to have a higher wage economy. And then we'll talk about the job check requirements, and that's at the point where I'll pass over to my colleague Craig, who will go through those job check requirements for you. And then I'll come back again to talk about applying for the Accredited Employer Work Visa from the migrant's perspective, and then open it up to Q&A. So it's a tier system, and most of you will probably be familiar with this already because you'll already be down that pathway. But the first step of the employer accreditation commenced on the 23rd of May, which was basically all employers who want to recruit migrant workers from either offshore or onshore need to become accredited. And that took effect from the 23rd of May. Employers were able to submit an application online, and it was an online application. If you haven't already applied for accreditation, it's relatively straightforward. It's online application. We take it at face value to a large extent. So when you apply for accreditation, what you say in your application, we will accept at face value based on the fact that you're going to provide us with accurate and truthful information. In some occasions, we may need to come back to an employer for further information just to clarify, but it's the whole process online with drop-down menus, easily understood, and from what I've heard in terms of feedback, that process has been working pretty well. And most applications have been considered and approved within 10 days. So that's stage one, which started on the 23rd of May. You don't have to become accredited until you're looking to recruit somebody from offshore. Or if you've got somebody already working for you and they're on an essential skills work visa currently, or on a work to residence visa, it would only be when you were looking to renew that visa and were unable to find a New Zealand permanent resident or citizen that you would need to make sure that you were accredited by that time. The second step, which started on the 20th of June, was the job check. So once you become accredited, you then apply for a job check through Immigration New Zealand. And then yesterday, well, the 4th of July, which was 2 days ago, people were able to actually apply for a work visa. So stage two, the job check itself, once that's approved, then you're free to recruit migrant workers, knowing full well that you've been given approval to recruit for that particular role. Thanks, Crispin. Just a bit about the immigration rebalance. As I said, this is part of the government's plan to use immigration to increase, higher productivity and to have a higher wage economy. So part of that, and it's all linked into the Accredited Employer Work visa. So as of the 4th of July, people applying for Accredited Employer Work visas will need to be paid above the median wage, which is $27.76 an hour. If you're not being paid above $27.76 effectively, there's not a pathway as such for you to come in to work in New Zealand. There are some exceptions to that for hospitality, aged care, where it's kind of recognised that those roles are in demand and there's simply not enough people in New Zealand to be able to fill those roles, and therefore there's an exception to the median wage for those particular sectors. The green list is for highly skilled, hard to fill occupations, and there's two pathways to residence on that pathway, and Craig will talk to you a little bit more about that in the job check side of things. And then there's going to be sector agreements for sectors where there's a temporary or ongoing need for access to lower paid migrants. Now those sector agreements are still being negotiated and discussed, and that's why in the meantime there's been some exceptions to the median wage to allow for those sectors to bring people in the knowledge that they won't be able to meet the $27.76 an hour realistically. Next slide. Employer accreditation, so we'll talk about that. So to become accredited, there's two options. One is what we call standard accreditation, and that's if you're going to be recruiting up to 5 migrant workers on an accredited employer work visa over a 12-month period. So if you think to yourself, well, you know, we might need 4, then you can just apply for the standard accreditation. But if you're on the cusp and you think, well, it could be 5, it could be 6, it could be 8, just go for the high volume accreditation right from the very outset. And that's for 6 or more migrant workers. So 6 or more, it will be compulsory for you to apply for the high volume accreditation. And then there's some additional requirements for franchisees or what we call labour hire companies, where the person's recruited and contracted out to another company. So they're called controlling third parties, and there's additional requirements that the principal employer would need to meet on the basis that if they're going to contract people out to another company, we need to be sure that the company that they're contracting the workers out to is also familiar with health and safety requirements, employment law, etc. Next slide. So there's some minimum requirements for all employers to meet for your accreditation. You've got to be viable, genuinely operating business with an IRD registered in New Zealand business number. You've got to provide settlement support activities and have a plan for new migrants that will come to your business in terms of settlement support options. So that's things like, you know, how do you get an IRD number, relevant training institutions, accommodation, schools, banking system, citizens advice bureau, any kind of regional community organisations that might be relevant to those migrant workers. You must comply with immigration, employment and business standards. You have to pay all the recruitment costs, so you can't on-charge those to the migrant. You have to also complete employer learning online learning modules, and that's through Employment New Zealand. They have online employment modules that you'd be expected to complete, and also you must allow your employees to complete those online learning modules as well. And those learning modules are around employment law, what the workers' rights are, what they can expect from an employer in New Zealand. So and the whole purpose behind this is to try and minimise migrant exploitation by enabling the migrant workers to understand their work rights when they're working for an employer in New Zealand. So the accreditation period for generally for high volume and standard, the accreditation, it will be for 24 months. For franchises and employers that place migrants with controlling third parties, it'll be 12 months. And as I said at the beginning, it's online. We will take you at face value for what you tell us about your company and what you commit to do. At the end of the 12 months, when it comes up for renewal, that's when it's possible that immigration case officers might contact you to provide evidence of what you said you were going to do in your initial accredited employer application. And the reason that we're doing it that way is because the number of employers that will need to become accredited is quite significant. And in order for us to have the resource to be able to verify everything is would be exceptionally difficult and resource intensive. So for the first 12 months, we'll be taking it on face value. Thanks. So these are just the fees. Standard accreditation up to 5 migrants at any one time, 740. High volume, 6 or more, 1220. And you can read the fees there. For labour hire companies and employers placing migrants with controlling third parties, it's more expensive, and that's because of the verification that's required and the immigration being satisfied that the third party and the requirements around third parties, that the information and verification requirements for that. It means that there's more resource required for franchises and controlling third parties. So I'll pass over now to Craig, who'll talk you through all the job check requirements, and then I'll come back for the actual application for the work visa by the migrant worker. So thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, so once you become accredited, the next stage is the job check. And the purpose of this really is just to ensure there are no New Zealanders available to do the job, which is very similar to the requirements for the previous essential skills work visa, where employers, as part of the process, had to show that you have made attempts to recruit New Zealanders. Next slide, thanks. So there's different ways in which the job check applies. There are some situations where you must advertise the job. And as Carl mentioned, if the role is paid the median wage, you must advertise. But there are two scenarios where you don't need to provide evidence of advertising, and that's where it's paid at least twice the median. So the median being $27.26 an hour, or if the occupation is on this new green list, which has been in the news a bit over the last few days. So in both those examples, you don't need to provide evidence of advertising, but you still need to do the job check or apply for the job check. There's also a fourth option, which doesn't really apply to the IT sector though, where there are some sectors where there is a lower wage threshold for some occupations, but it doesn't relate to the IT sector. So in terms of what is the green list, it provides for a pathway to residence, only in certain occupations in the sector though. So it's not every role. So just the green list is actually on the website, but just to give you an idea of some of the roles that it applies to in the IT sector is Chief Information Officer, ICT Project Manager, Software Engineer, ICT Security Specialist. And for those roles, there's a minimum salary requirement of at least $57.69 an hour, which equates to around about $120,000 salary per year. And there's another role of multimedia specialist with a slightly lower minimum salary of $45.67 an hour, which is around the $95,000 mark. So for those people, in addition to being able to get a work visa under this Accredited Employer Work Visa policy, they can also have a pathway to residence. We're expecting more detail to be announced on that in the next few months, maybe by about September. But for those people that meet the criteria, it certainly can be a bit more attractive in terms of coming to New Zealand, because they can be eligible for residence pretty much straight away. You might have heard in the news, there's some occupations where they need to wait 2 years before they're eligible for residence. So that is those occupations. There's two tiers on the green list, and tier 1 is straight to residence, which is those roles I just referred to. And for some other sectors, it's tier 2, where they have to wait 2 years before they become eligible. So what it means is that if it's on the green list, you don't need to provide evidence of advertising as long as they meet the salary requirement and the ANZCO requirements for that particular occupation. Next slide, thanks. So when you are putting in a job check application, the employment has to meet certain requirements, and that includes that it has to be for full-time work, which for immigration purposes is at least 30 hours a week, paid at the market rate or for that particular occupation, and at least the median wage. People have to be paid at least monthly, and the employment agreement that you provide obviously has to be lawful with all the relevant employment laws. This type of visa doesn't apply to self-employment or for certain occupations in the horticulture and viticulture industries. One of the things we're just hearing now that these job check applications are starting to come in is that some of the employment agreements that are being submitted with the application aren't fully compliant with employment law. So you may just want to double check that you meet all the relevant employment law requirements with your employment agreements before you submit a job check. Otherwise it may be returned. So the job check needs to, as I said, include a detailed job description and the proposed employment agreement. The fee for the job check is $610. It can apply to multiple jobs though if the jobs are all the same. So if, for argument's sake, you needed maybe 6 software engineers, for example, you can apply for those 6 roles all with the one job check. You don't have to apply 6 times over. But you need to make that very clear at the job check stage so that all that information is consistent all the way through. In other words, when the person comes to apply for a visa, you can't say I meant to put in 6 jobs when you've only provided details for the one. But the thing I'd stress there is that it has to be exactly the same role in the same locations as well, as to where you are employing those people if you're applying for multiple jobs as part of the one job check. Next slide, thanks. So there's specific requirements what the advertisements that you advertise must include. This is if you do have to advertise. As I touched on before, there are some scenarios where you don't need to provide evidence of advertising. And there's a couple of new requirements here that you possibly maybe have in your normal advertising in the past. And so the job description detailing the key tasks and responsibilities, the terms and conditions of employment, which again have to meet the consistency with employment agreement. And the other thing that has to be included is the pay range and the hours of work for the role. So again, just some of the feedback we've had lately is that some employers' advertising hasn't included that, and therefore it hasn't met the minimum job check requirements. So when we say the pay range, you don't need to provide the exact salary for the role, but it might be between X and Y. You need to provide that range as part of the advertising, if in fact you have to advertise for the role. And obviously providing details of the minimum requirements that the person needs to meet in terms of qualifications, work experience, and their skills, etc. So in terms of the attempts that you have to show to recruit, there's some certain timeframes that are met as well. And these are fairly important to note. So, sorry, I've just lost my place for a moment. Yeah, so you need to advertise on general national advertising websites, so the likes of Seek or Trade Me, or if you do have any industry specific ones within the IT sector, they could be considered as well. The advertising has to run for at least 14 calendar days, and that has to end before you can actually make a job check application. The other time frame to be aware of is that you could still apply for a job check as long as it's within 90 days of the advertising ending. And in other words, from the end date, not when you started advertising. So in other words, you've got about 3 months in which to use that advertising. In fact, you could use it again if you needed to do a subsequent job check if that need was there, as long as it's still within that 90-day time frame. So when a job check is approved, it's valid for 6 months, unless your accreditation expires or lapses prior to that time. And the job check will actually specify the occupation, all the minimum requirements for the job based on the information you've provided to Immigration New Zealand, and obviously who the employer is named on as well. So again, very similar to what you've done before. So I'll hand over to Carl and he'll tell you what the next stage is. Stage 3 of effectively is the migrants part of the process once you've had your job check approved.
Thanks very much, Craig. We can probably go, yep, to the next slide. So, I mean, all this really is probably to a large extent what you were doing in the past, but previously it was always the individual, the migrant worker, that had to make the application for the work visa. And you'd offer them a job, they'd make their application for a work visa, but they'd be required to provide your evidence of advertising and why you deemed no New Zealand permanent residents or citizens available to fill the role. So this whole process has tipped it upside down and basically said it's more the responsibility of the employer to have that job check approved so that they can then go and recruit migrant workers in the knowledge that the job is already pre-approved, and so long as the individual making the application for the work visa meets those requirements, you can be confident that 90% of the time that particular individual will be approved the work visa as well. So for the individual themselves, obviously they've got to match up with what you advertise the role for. And Craig mentioned the green list. We're talking now for any particular position that's not on the green list that requires you to go through that job check process. And once you've selected the individual, they've got to provide a copy of the employment agreement that you're offering them, and a copy of a signed offer of employment, but that could also be incorporated into the employment agreement. So you don't have to provide both. It would be just the employment agreement so long as it's signed. And you will provide the worker with what they call a job check number. And what we understand is that's probably going to end up being like an URL that you will send to the individual, and that'll be like their number, reference number. So you've offered the person the job, you provide them with a number that you've been allocated for the job check that was approved. So if you have 3 people, you've now allocated one person one of those tokens or that job number, and they use that so that when they submit their application, they quote that number. That then matches up with your with you as the employer in the role that you've been offering, and then immigration can check that so that the advertisement, whatever the advertisement said, does that line up with the skills and qualifications and the job description that that individual is applying for. So it's kind of a matching process. So obviously for the individual, they've got to meet character and they've got to meet health requirements. So whilst you might, recruit a particular individual, we still need to be sure that before we approve that work visa for them, the Accredited Employer Work Visa, that they meet the health and character, and that they hold an offer of employment that actually matches up with what your advertisement said the job was about. So that's just ensuring that migrant exploitation doesn't occur, that the employment agreement matches up with what the employer said they were offering, and we can see that they all line up. We obviously will check that they're suitably qualified by the training and experience to do the job offered, and we've got the box on the bottom right hand side there where employment is paid below the median wage, the migrant's not subject to a stand down period. We're not going to cover that here because it won't apply to you. We will then issue the work visa for 3 years, which is pretty much the same as it is now under what was essential skills, which is now finished. So they'll be issued 3 years, and will be specific to the particular employer. So obviously with Accredited Employer Work Visa, same as essential skills, it will be specific to the employer. Now they can apply for a variation of conditions to another employer that is an accredited employer. The detail of that we don't have quite signed off or detailed just yet in terms of the variation of conditions and what the requirements might be, but that will be an option, the same as it is now. So the pathways to residence that Craig was talking about before, the green list occupations, they'll get a 2-year work to residence or fast track straight to residence. And as Craig mentioned, there's 2 different categories, 2 pathways. The ones that have been on the news at the moment that everybody's kind of been jumping up and down about is nurses. And why aren't they on a pathway that's directly straight to residence? The government's decision was that in the case of nurses, they'll need to work for 2 years before they can apply for residence, so they're not on that first priority. If they're paid twice the median wage, they'll get a 2-year work to residence visa as well. And then there's mention there of the skilled migrant category. So that's the old point system for point system as it was until it was postponed and when COVID broke out. And the government will be looking at the skilled migrant category to determine where to from here in terms of what the government decides they need by way of skilled migrants coming into New Zealand. We don't have any detail on that. We expect that to come out at some point this year in terms of what will the skilled migrant category look like. It may be that the government decides they don't need as many people coming in, you know, in terms of the numbers, given that we've just approved somewhere around 160,000 new migrants under the Residents 2021 policy. The government might decide, well, you know, we've got a lot of people, the impact on infrastructure, health, education, roading, transport, etc., may be that they want to reduce the number coming in, but increase the points so that we attract in line with their rebalance, higher skilled, higher paid migrant workers to, you know, contribute to the economy better than what it was under the existing skilled migrant category. And that's about it from us. And as I said, you know, we've provided that on a fairly high level, just in terms of time, being able to get through it. But we can certainly open it up to questions now, and hopefully we'll be able to answer them for you.
Fabulous. Thank you both very much. I was worried when I saw you had 44 slides. I thought they're never going to get through that in half an hour, but you absolutely nailed it. I'm really impressed. I'm going to ask a question that's not asked in the Q&A, but I'm going to ask that first. So earlier this year, it was announced that we had these 600 technology worker border exemptions. And obviously things have moved on pretty quickly and our borders have reopened. What's going to happen to those 600 tech worker border exemptions in that visa type? Right, so we expect that that will go because there will be no need for it once the Accredited Employer Work visa policy, you know, falls into place. We're effectively going back to what it was pre-COVID. And so those border exceptions will no longer be needed because the government's opening up from 1st of August, effectively, all policies. And it's hard to get your head around because we've been with COVID so long, and trying to remember what it was like pre-COVID has been fairly difficult. So it's just a matter of imagining, pretend COVID hadn't happened, we revert back to the way things were pre-COVID, except we've got a slightly different work visa policy. But for example, right, visitors, students, partners, all those other policy options, work visa specific purpose, will all just revert back to the way they were previously. The only thing that's really changing is the Accredited Employer Work visa and how people go about applying for them. But that class exception will more than likely go. We don't know for sure exactly when, but there'll be no need for it because the Accredited Employer Work visa will take over. And it's great the way you've just described the streamlined process of the accredited employer. You know, I remember back in the dim, dark days applying to be an accredited employer and how hard that was. So congratulations, Immigration, on resolving that for all of us. Now, we've got a few questions about the green list scattered amongst the questions. So the first thing is if there are, as you know, the digital technology industry, we like to reinvent ourselves and create new positions and roles and titles all the time. How often is the green list revisited? Is it something that's fluid, or is it pretty set in stone? How does that work? So there's no intention to... Oh, you go, Craig. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say initially it's not going to be reviewed for at least 12 months. So it's only just come into effect. Good to know. So we are still waiting to also find out what the review process will be. That's being worked on pretty much as we speak. But there's no review of it for the next year or so. But during that year, we'll obviously find out what the review process will be so that industry groups like yourself could make submissions if that was going to be one of the ways of being able to lobby to get different roles included.
Absolutely, and I know we've done it in the past, so that's good to know. One question that Angela has asked, if we've got a green list role that we're wanting to fill, do we still need to apply for the job check process?
Yes, you do, but obviously there's no need to provide evidence of advertising, but you still have to go through the job check where you're providing evidence of the employment agreement and the job description and that kind of thing.
Okay, good to know. Now, there's a couple of questions around the job check process. There was one about if we have a role, a generic role like a software engineer role, for example, which I think was one of the examples that you gave, Craig, early on, but then within, and Lisa's asking if she's got 6 software engineers that she's looking for, but they all need to have different specializations, like an automation one or a DevOps one or a backend one. Do they need to be processed as 6 different job checks, or can it be one software engineer process for the 6 roles? Or is that getting a little bit specific?
Probably broadly, because it's going to be based on the ENSCO codes, the Australia and New Zealand Standard Classification of Occupations, because the title doesn't mean anything, it's more the job description. So what is the job? And if those 5 jobs are basically the same job description, then you'd probably be able to just do the one job check, because the title's not the important part, it's the nature of the job. Yep, so you might call them something different. Yeah.
And just for everyone that's on this call, there is quite a bit of work going on across New Zealand and Australia around ENSCO codes and around the SOFIA framework, the skills framework for the information age, to get some consistency of position descriptions. So feel free to reach out to me if you want to ask questions about that. So hopefully that'll help with some of these nuances our industry like to introduce into the mix. We've got quite a few questions about the salary range needed in advertising. So the flavour of some of the questions is within Trade Me and Seek, you need to put a role into a salary range. Do you need to then explicitly also write the salary range into the position being advertised, or is it enough to use the tools kind of salary range function? And then the second kind of theme to those questions, is it okay, given our salary ranges are already so high for the digital technology industry, just to have a minimum starting from without putting that upper limit on salaries when jobs are advertised?
Well, in answer to the second question, no, you do need to provide the range. So it's the start point and end point. And also that range does need to be included in the ad, even though somewhere else on the advertising website it might. The part of the reason for that is that your range might be within that range, but it's slightly different. So by way of example, if the salary goes from 100 to 150, but your one's within that range, but your one actually goes from 100 to 140, you need to be specifying that. The other thing I'll just remind you of, though, is if the job's paid twice the median wage, you don't need to provide evidence of advertising. So in addition to the green list role, there's also that highly paid of 2 times the median where advertising is not needed at all as part of the job check requirement.
And I think that it's really important for everyone listening to this to remember, because there are so many digital technology. Our median salary for digital technology as of the beginning of last year, when ITP and NZ Tech surveyed, was already double the New Zealand median wage. So yes.
Yeah, so twice the median would be 55, 52 an hour. So you're up around the 115,000 mark.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a couple of questions around families. One is, does this extend to families? And the other, there's a question from Karen about, with the new agreement between the UK and New Zealand for working visas, can these people bring dependents in as well? Do you have any comments on that?
Well, under this policy, the Accredited Employer Work visa, yes, people can bring their family just like they've been able to under the existing or the previous work visa policy. So yeah, if you've got the spouse or partner and children, they can come with you under this type of visa. And the second part was about working holiday visa.
Yeah, the
changes,
new
is that right?
announcement with the UK. Yeah, do you know yet if
We haven't seen
families
any
can
detail
come?
about when that takes effect. I think when the announcement was made last week, they were talking about 2024, but I know that some industries are lobbying to try and get that brought forward to help with their skill shortages.
I think just to add to what Craig's saying there, and just for everybody's interest in terms of the working holiday schemes too, you need to be a little bit careful with working holiday schemes, because the whole intention behind a working holiday is exactly that. It's a working holiday. So if you've got people that you want to bring in to work, but you're suggesting that they come in on a working holiday scheme, you just need to be a wee bit careful with that, because customs can ask for what's your bona fides, and if you are coming in on a working holiday scheme but you've actually got a job already lined up, then you should have gone through the Accredited Employer Work visa, because your purpose for coming here is actually to work. It's not working holiday. There's nothing to stop you taking people on a working holiday scheme once they're here, but I'd suggest you avoid offering them a role and then telling them to apply for a working holiday visa, because they can run into problems in terms of, well, what's your bona fides in terms of your intention of coming to New Zealand.
So that kind of leads to another nuanced question that Adish has asked, where if a person's in New Zealand when their partner is here on a work visa, but they're here on a visitor visa, can they potentially then be employed? Can one of the employers on here then potentially employ them and go through this this visa employment, the work visa process, when they're already in the country on a visitor visa for quite valid reasons?
Yeah, so that's fine. So if they're here, if they're already here on a visitor visa, and the employer says, "Oh, jeepers, we'd like to employ you. You've got the skills and qualifications we need," they can just go through the Accredited Employer Work visa process.
Excellent.
So it's nothing to stop people coming in as visitors and then applying for work once they're here, because their intention was to come here as a visitor to start with, or as a partner of a worker that's already been approved, but nothing to stop them applying once they're here.
Excellent. That's really good to know. There's a really specific question you might not be able to answer, but I will ask you to find out. At the moment, it sounds like LinkedIn isn't one of the permitted job boards for advertising, and LinkedIn's where a lot of people in our industry advertise. Is there a process to potentially that we can apply for to get LinkedIn added to the list alongside Seek and Trade Me and whichever other ones?
Well, generally most forms of social media aren't acceptable for advertising, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn. I know LinkedIn's probably calling it social media might be a wee bit of a stretch, but yeah, normally it's normally social media is not generally acceptable, no, but I know a lot of people do pick up roles through LinkedIn. But from the immigration perspective, it's not generally an accepted. I mean, you could use LinkedIn as well as something else, but not solely.
But we've already answered all of the aforementioned questions about the need to advertise if your job is in the green list anyway. So that's that may be just a nuance.
Or the highly paid,
Yeah, that's right. Now, Chris just asked a question. Craig, you mentioned the job check lasts for 6 months once approved. Is this 6 months for the candidate to apply for the work visa, or 6 months for them to start work?
No, to apply. So in other words, you've got 6 months to find a candidate and get them to put their application in. They can then, when they get here or take up the job, that could be after that, depending on how long it takes for the visa to actually be issued. But yeah, they've got 6 months to use that job check approval to apply for their visa.
And do you have a rule of thumb of how long visas take? Well, someone has asked the question of what's the time frame for these visas to be issued. I'm sure every individual one is uniquely different, but is there a kind of a general timeline?
You going to tell them, Craig?
All right. So for all these 3 stages, there's different time frames. So should we call it the target time frames? and bear in mind there's a wee bit of slippage with some of these, but yeah, so for the first part of the employer accreditation, that's 10 working days, and same for the job check, that's 10 working days as well. And then for the actual applicant's visa, the target there is 20 working days. And most of them are going through within those timeframes at the moment. I mean, no one's applied for the visa yet. It only opened 2 days ago, or very few people have. There's been a couple of delays with the accredited employer part, but the bulk of them have all gone through within around about the 10 days.
That's really good to know. And really again, bad old days used to be a very slow process. So really pleased to hear that. That's great.
Ironically, talking to your sector, there's been a couple of technical glitches where some of them have been delayed, but or as we said before, with some of the job checks where they perhaps haven't met the requirements of the employment agreement and that kind of thing. That's delayed the processing, where the immigration staff have had to go back to the employer to seek more clarification or get them to change the employment agreement if it hasn't met the minimum standards.
And just a point on that too, just to re-emphasise what Craig's saying there, because the feedback we've had is that there's a lot of people, a lot of employers not meeting that criteria, especially around the advertising and the hours of work in the employment contracts, because they've got to be crystal clear. Because you can say, well, a person's being paid a salary, and yeah, that's fine, but how many hours is he working for that salary? So we base it on a 40-hour week in terms of a salary. So we just divide by 52, divide by 40, and then you get your hourly rate, because potentially, and that's also, you know, related to migrant exploitation, where we want to be sure that a worker is actually being paid for the hours of work. So that's why the hours of work clause and the is really important in terms of the employment contract that's being submitted, and the advertising around making sure that you have the range. Because if you don't, I mean, at the moment they're requesting further information, but it's going to get to the point where they just decline it. So you don't want to lose your money by not providing the information correctly up front.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good nuance for people to understand. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you 2 more questions, which hopefully will be quite quick. Something that's a really new and emerging situation for us as employers with COVID is often we're employing people that are already located overseas, and then wanting to bring them, now employers are wanting to often relocate them into the country. So they've been working for a company, but remotely offshore. Is this the process that they follow for that, or is there a different process for that scenario?
So
no,
it's
this would be the process. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Carl, where you go?
Yeah. You know, I was just going to say, yeah, they've got to go through the Accredited Employer Work visa, because the Immigration Act doesn't apply until people are actually coming to New Zealand. So whilst they're working offshore, the Immigration Act doesn't apply. But once they come onshore, then the Immigration Act applies, and they'd have to apply for a work visa through the Accredited Employer Work visa. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this has been uncharted territory for us here in Aotearoa, and it's becoming quite a real situation now, with many employers being unable to bring people in for that 2 years, employing people offshore. So good to know that this streamlined process still applies. And the last question I should have asked you at the beginning, so I'm going to put you on the spot. Will we be able to share these slides with everyone who attended the webinar?
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. There we go. Right. Well, we've kept time. There were more questions, so I will send them through to you, Carl and Craig, and then for everyone who's here who's asked those questions, I'll facilitate getting the answers back, which will likely, for some of them which are quite specific, will be a link to the relevant place on the Immigration New Zealand website. Thank you both so much for your time today and coming along. We ended up with over 26 questions from people. So a lot of interest here, and we'll probably invite you back for a follow-up in a few months' time once it's all up and running and people have a bit of experience under their belts.
They got more questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure they will.
Yeah.
So thank you both. Thanks.
All right. Thank
Thanks
you.
to everyone
You're welcome.
who's been listening today. Ka kite.